Today we're going to tell you what happens to the crews inside tanks when they ended up like this. And we'll do it through the turbulent story of the Panzer IV, the tank that saw the bulk of the heaviest action in World War II. It fought in Europe, across the deserts of North Africa, and all the way to the Eastern Front. So it's no surprise its crews were never short of horror stories. So first thing to move out of the way is that the Panzer IV was created not to be a tank, but to support other tanks. At least that was the idea in 1934 when it was developed. However, very soon in the war, its original role would drastically change, and it would become the closest thing to a main battle tank concept the Germans had, but only by coincidence. You see, the Panzer IV was not intended to be a tank, but artillery that could follow the infantry directly into the firefight, like an accompanying vehicle. Funny enough, this name and medium tractor were actually given to it during development in secrecy under the Treaty of Versailles, because Germany was a bit banned from developing weapons after the First World War. But guess what they were doing? Jokes aside, the thinking at the time was that Panzer Is and IIs would carry machine guns. The Panzer III would be a dedicated tank killer. Again, this sounds funny from today's standpoint when you say a tank armed with a 37mm gun was a tank killer, while the Panzer IV would complement them, filling the gap of high explosive power that these small caliber guns lacked. Because of that, it was initially armed with a 75mm howitzer-like gun, and it was intended to stop only small arms fire. So its armor initially ranged only between 8 and 16mm. But this was still the Model A, and other models with improvements began coming in soon, improving armor, optics, visibility, and so on. The 5 crewmen inside were actually not tankers, but artillerymen at first. They had quite a modern layout inside, with the designated loader and gunner sitting left and right of the gun breech, while the commander was in the middle and behind at the highest point for better visibility. The driver and assistant driver / radio operator / bow machine gunner sat in front, as you probably already know. This way the crew could communicate quite well with good visibility, which would be very important for what was about to come. Then came the infamous September 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland, and time for the Panzer IV to try its fortune in real combat. At this point, the Germans had just a little over 200 of them, out of roughly 2,700 tanks they possessed. Panzer IVs were distributed sparingly across divisions, and together with them spearheaded the new Lightning War. They pushed through Poland for 72 hours straight, without stopping for anything. If you wonder how crews managed to fight for 3 days, the answer is German quote-unquote focus enhancement pills they gave them, if you know what I mean. I shouldn't mention this on YouTube as one video, where I talked about it got age restricted. Nevertheless, going back to combat, a highly organized, coordinated operation with all army branches working together exactly as intended made the Panzer IV shine in its initial role. The 75mm howitzer was effective against bunkers and fortifications, supporting infantry exactly as planned. They came upon a couple of heavy Char B1s and British Matilda IIs that showed the Germans they needed more powerful guns for their Panzer III, because the Panzer IV was never expected to fight other tanks anyway, at least for now. The armor was deemed quite vulnerable, as even anti-tank rifles and small-caliber anti-tank guns could go through it. 76 Panzer IVs were knocked out here, 19 of them beyond repair, and crews cried for better protection, so applique plates would be added later. Although roughly 1/3 of the Panzer IVs the Germans had at the time were lost in this campaign, they proved the concept could indeed work with some upgrades. And this was just the beginning of its life in World War II, because now we come to North Africa. As the war shifted to the desert and American M3 Lees and Shermans arrived, they became quite a struggle for the Panzer III. The Panzer III was already, as the war began, in the process of replacing its 37mm so-called door knocker gun with a 50mm, but here it hit the limit of its upgrades. The problem was the smaller turret ring, and Germany's tank killer hit the ceiling with a gun that became less effective each month of the war. So this is when the Panzer IV would drop its infantry support role and become the main battle tank sort of. That's because the Panzer IV had a larger turret ring and could house the bigger anti-tank gun, which would be the Paquet 40, the 75mm towed anti-tank gun, just modified for tank use. Now this thing was a mean high-velocity anti-tank weapon, and it was dangerous to all Allied tanks throughout the war. But the problem was that the Panzer IV was never designed to be a tank-fighting tank, and all of a sudden it found itself in exactly this role. When they appeared first in North Africa, they shocked the Allies with the sudden improvement. They called them Panzer IV Specials and quickly learned what this gun could do to their tanks. But still, they didn't have armor to fight tanks, and Panzer IV crews had to move, spot, and shoot first if they wanted to live. If hit with anything more serious than machine guns, the armor wouldn't stop it, and if fire didn't break out immediately, which it usually did, the spalling and concussion would kill or wound the crew most of the time. They also suffered a lot from mechanical breakdowns in the desert, and were eventually outnumbered and defeated in the North African campaign when America entered the war with huge numbers of then-new Shermans. Surviving panzers were destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Crews would hammer rocks into the barrel of the gun and then load a shell and fire it remotely to blow off the gun, then put sand in fuel tanks and run them until the engine died. Quite a sad end, but this was only one chapter of its book, because now the war shifted to the deadliest and worst theatre where the Panzer IV would see most of its action, and most of the horrors for its crews: the Eastern Front. In June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched, out of over 3,000 tanks driving into the Soviet Union, about 400 were Panzer IVs, early D and E models with short guns. At first they seemed to perform as usual, but within weeks of the operation the real shock came for the Germans when they realized the Soviets had tanks no one knew about. All of a sudden, from seas of light BT series tanks that German tanks were knocking out all over the place, emerged heavier tanks like the KV-1 and T-34. All of a sudden, 37mm anti-tank guns were out of the question for dealing with them, and even upgraded Panzer IIIs with 50mm guns had problems knocking these out frontally. Soviet tanks seemed invincible to anything the Germans had at the time, besides 88mm flak guns, and they caused real panic through their ranks. Something had to be done. And after Germany sent their specials to the front to examine the situation, they found the best solution was to urgently upgun all the Panzer IVs with the 75mm long-barreled anti-tank gun, as they had done earlier in North Africa. So, the same thing happened. They got the gun and were pushed to fight tanks, despite never being designed nor trained for such a job. Another huge problem on the Eastern Front for German tanks was that most of them were vulnerable to Soviet 13mm anti-tank rifles, especially when hit from the sides at close ranges. Even the Panther had this problem when it arrived, let alone the much thinner armored Panzer IV. The Red Army had a ton of these anti-tank rifles, and they were especially deadly in urban engagements when they attacked from buildings, shooting through the thin roofs of tanks. One such round was more than enough to disable a tank, as it would ricochet around the inside, taking out the crew and causing some terrible painting with red color in the interior. German tankers quickly learned to fear the anti-tank rifles. They began mounting additional plates on the sides and turrets that they called Schürzen. This way, the armor-piercing round would first go through them and tumble, losing the energy needed to penetrate the main armor. Although crews were frustrated with them, as they limited the view and were very easy to rip off when driving through thick brush. Now once the tank is hit, what are the possible outcomes for the crew? Well, that depends on what they're being hit with. We mentioned anti-tank rifles and what a small armor-piercing round could do inside the tank. But what about other weapons? Like maybe this Soviet 152mm howitzer mounted on their SU and ISU series of self-propelled guns. Look at this, for example. It is a turret, or maybe better said, it was a turret of a Panzer IV hit by that weapon. For the crew inside, there would not be an open casket. As for the standard anti-tank rounds the Allies had, it was never good news to be hit by one of them, but at least almost none of them had explosive filler like German shells had. They were mostly solid shots that would not explode upon penetration, but they were more than capable of setting the ammo and fuel on fire and turning the tank into a huge fireball. Then, as the anti-tank rifles were a pain in the arse on the Eastern Front, in the West German crews had American bazookas, rifle anti-tank grenades, and British Piats to keep them thinking. They all had somewhat similar penetration power and were all deadly for the Panzer IV, although side skirts did help by detonating warheads away from the main armor. If hit, the shaped charged jet would punch through the armor and spray the ammo, fuel, and of course the crew with molten metal. Unlike what many people think, fire inside the tank was not usually caused by fuel, but by the ammunition stored inside. The Panzer IV carried some 87 rounds for the main gun all around the tank, and if that was set on fire, there would not be much left of the tank or the crew. While the Sherman would clear its Tommy Cooker reputation later in the war with the introduction of wet stowage, which dramatically reduced the chances of fire erupting inside the tank to around 10 to 15%, the Panzer IV never received such upgrades. They had a very high chance of catching fire after being hit, around 80%, and it remained basically the same until the very end of the war. And still the Sherman is the one remembered for bursting into flames. As for evacuation from the tank, the Panzer IV at least had hatches for every single crew member, while the Sherman, for example, early in the war had just a single hatch for 3 men in the turret. However, the gunner and loader had these side hatches, which were not the easiest thing to get through, even if you were well motivated by fire spreading under your legs. Now seriously, these side hatches were quite difficult to get through, and you can find photos on the internet of German crews dangling halfway through after they did not get out in time. I cannot describe it more than this. There were also other improvised weapons like satchel charges and Molotovs, mostly used by the Soviets in close-quarters urban combat. Tanks of the time were not completely sealed and watertight, and if hit by sticky burning liquid, it could go through the turret ring and hatches and drip inside. Even Soviet soldiers said that despite German tanks causing them huge losses, there was no worse fate than being a tanker. Despite all the so-called wonder tanks that were later romanticized, like the Panthers, Tigers, and enormous 70-ton heavy tank destroyers, the main workhorse for German armor was the Panzer IV. It was the tank that could work and be where it was needed, while those wonder weapons were built in numbers too small to change the outcome of the war, not to mention their notorious unreliability. So, this initially infantry support sort of assault gun was now about to be pushed into some of the largest tank battles in history. It saw terrifying action at Kursk in savage tank-on-tank combat, with understandably huge losses, although it inflicted much higher losses on Soviet armor with its new guns. As the T-34 upgraded its gun to an 85mm and new heavy tanks like the IS-2 with its 122mm gun arrived on the Eastern Front, Panzer IV crews were now rarely able to survive such hits. And as bad as it was, from this point on, after losing at Kursk and Stalingrad, it was just going to get worse and worse for them. While this was going on in the east, the Allies landed in Sicily and Normandy, and were slowly but surely fighting their way towards Berlin. In Normandy, the Panzer IV again saw incredibly heavy action, fighting Allied Shermans, Churchills, and Cromwells, with American tank destroyers and British Sherman Fireflies, coupled with fighter-bomber aircraft armed with rockets now making their life increasingly difficult. But the Allies were just one part of their problems. The other part came from Germany itself, as it went low on fuel and materials necessary for tank production. For example, when they ran out of rubber, Panzer IVs were made with wheels without rubber, just metal, grinding over metal tracks. Allied soldiers said they could hear the German tanks squeaking from a mile away. The much bigger problem was the shortage of manganese that impacted all German tanks produced later in the war. Their armor quality was nowhere near that of early war production when they still had resources, and it was now much more brittle and prone to splintering, with even whole plates shattering when hit. These razor-sharp metal fragments flew into crews' faces inside, killing them even with non-penetrating hits that would not otherwise have destroyed the tank. As the situation became increasingly desperate, the Panzer IV Model J was not an improved, but a degraded model. The Germans either simplified or removed anything they could to make production possible, so these were going into battle without powered traverse for the turret, with degraded armor, sometimes lacking optics or even radios, not to mention the long-gone fancy ergonomic gadgets. They even cut the paint, and instead of the usual ivory white for better visibility inside the tank, they left the red oxide primer. Forced labor used in production was also waging the war on the Germans as much as they could, sabotaging engines or fuel lines whenever possible, like dropping bolts and nuts in fuel tanks, etc. Crew training also dropped from the original 16-week program to 4 weeks or less. But by this point, everything was going against Germany, with Allied strategic bombing taking a heavy toll on their ability to wage war. So, despite never being intended to be a tank in essence, the Panzer IV in the end became the most produced German tank, with over 8,000 units fighting on every single front where the Germans were.